მოგესალმებით ჰაინრიხ ბიოლის ფონდის მწვანე აკადემიიდან, რომელიც ყოველწლიურად ტარდება. წელს მწვანე აკადემიის თემა სოციალური და გარემოსდაცვითი სამართლიანობა, შესაძლებლობები და შეზღუდვები. მე გახლავართ ერაძე, ერთ-ერთი მომხსენებელი წლევანდელ მწვანე აკადემიაში და ამჟამად ვარ კასელის უნივერსიტეტში პოლიტიკური მეცნიერებების ფაკულტეტზე დოქტორანტურის სტუდენტი. And we have invited Ulrich Brand for an interview. Professor Brand, who is invited in the frame of this Green Academy by Heinrich Bioll Foundation. He is a professor at the University of Vienna at the Faculty of Social Sciences. And he's doing research on the crisis of globalization, environmental politics in Latin America, and he's also a member of board in several scientific journals. So in the era of globalization and the acceleration of changes and the dominance of neoliberal discourse, we have a need to deal with multiple challenges on various levels of action in different spheres, from daily challenges to global processes, from poverty to gender discrimination and exploitation of nature and labor force. Such a world creates double challenge for small countries like Georgia. On the one hand, it needs to respond to local needs, and on the other hand, it can neither shape nor fully escape the tightly integrated global structure and imperative. So this is why we decided to ask Professor Brand for an interview in order to embed some of the key topics from the Georgian reality into the theoretical and also in a global context. So my first question to you would be connected to the idea of development, because this topic is one of the key topics discussed in Georgia right now, with the question of how to develop. And you have written on the power relations between the global north and the global south, and the multiple challenges that are also linked to the imperative of economic growth, which is usually decoupled from the questions of environmental and social justice. And this discourse is quite strong in Georgia as well. So how could we embed these debates into a broader context of development, and what could be the alternative ways of thinking of development?
Mm-hmm. So we have to admit that the concept of development will have its 70th birthday in some months, in January 2019, because in January 1949, Harry S. Truman, the former president of the United States, in his speech to the nation for the first time used the term of underdeveloped countries. This was kind of the moment of birth. And so since then, the whole thinking of North and South and of the global is that we have developed countries, which are the northern countries, the modern countries, the industrialized countries, the rich countries, and we have underdeveloped countries. And the idea of development is that the underdeveloped countries, the so-called underdeveloped countries, should take off to get its development. And development means usually to copy the West, which means capitalist development. Maybe in the Soviet era it was a bit different in the so-called second world, but the so-called third world should approach the first world, which means via capital investment, which means via a promotion of the elites, to send the elites to the global north to get their education, and then to bring back the ideas and others. And the major weakness, there are many weaknesses, but the major weakness of the whole thinking of development was that they thought states, nation states, supposedly independent nation states, we should remember that in 1949 the world was in upheaval. China was independent, India became independent, the anti-colonial, decolonial movements were very strong. In Bandung in the year 1955, the so-called bloc-free, the countries, Egypt, Indonesia and others, they didn't want to be subsumed under the idea that the first world is better. So the situation was that the first world, the North, had to defend its supremacy, its position, thinking that the states, the nations should develop, the now independent nations. But what was never part of the so-called developmentist discourse, this modernizing discourse, was the structure of global power, the structure of the world market. How can a country that is in the semi-periphery, on the periphery, that has no power, no economic power, should develop when US capital, European capital, the transnationals are exploiting the countries, when the own inner elites are not the vanguard of development. They are elites, they are oligarchies, they want to defend their positions, exploiting the workers, exploiting nature, exploiting indigenous peoples. So the critique of development is that there is an assumption of a homogenized nation, which is not the case. It's class-based, it's gender-based, it's racist very, very often, and that the structures of the capitalist world market, the structures of imperial politics are just neglected in this discourse. So in the 70s, 80s, a critique of this understanding of development started. And we have to admit that in the global north, this kind of capitalist development brought wealth. It brought, in the so-called Fordist area, in the so-called area of post-war capitalism, it brought some achievements for many people, but in the global south it was very different. It was polarizing, it was exploitative and so on. The critique started from dependency theory, from others, to say, no, it's not the internal factors, it's not the modernizing process of the nations, but it's the world market that impedes so-called development. The dependency theory, which came from Latin America, were not against the idea of development, but they said it's the world market that has to be changed. And then afterwards, in the 80s, the critique became more radical, saying, no, the very idea of development, of modernization, is a problem. It's called post-development or decolonial theories, saying that we need to rethink the capitalist economy. We need to invent other forms of economy. We need to invent other forms of state, of politics. We need to question power relations within our society and with our, at the international level. We have to question racism, which is a major aspect of if you like, underdevelopment, of power, of domination. And then, let's say, the modernizing forces try to counter this by putting adjectives, putting small words before the term of development. The most important until today is sustainable development. So it's not the old form of development, industrialization, growth. No, we need environmentally and socially sound forms of development. And now, I would say that now the currently most attractive adjective, the most attractive word, is inclusive development. Acknowledging that, of course, there are problems of polarization. Now we need new forms of inclusive development. But I would say this is the dominant form to reshape the understanding of development without questioning the core. The core is the north-south power relations, the power relations within the countries, the power relations within the universities, within academia, which is also very Anglo-Saxon. And I would still insist that we need to think beyond development. We need this post-development thinking, which really breaks with the very idea, even complemented with an adjective, with the very idea of development.
Yes, the question of power is indeed crucial, and not only in terms of the uneven power distribution between the global north and the global south, but also the access to power, so to say, also within the states, within the societies and the hierarchies that exist. But I suppose also that one of the critiques of these development approaches that are very dominant is that they are also very economistic, that they think in very much in economic terms, and then the questions of environment or the questions of human lives and conditions are also usually forgotten, and the costs, so to say, that are usually linked with such very economistic thinking of development. And if we think in these terms, there is this interesting also discipline of political ecology, and perhaps you could expand a bit the idea, what is it and what is the importance of political ecology in the debate?
Mm-hmm. To the first part of your question, I would say dominant thinking is able to integrate humans the lives, but they call it human capital. They are able to integrate nature, the enormous variety of nature. They call it nature capital. So you're right, it's very economistic, but they subsume the enormous variety of life to a thinking that it's part of capital, that it's part of the economy. And in this sense, you are right. Political ecology is a very broad approach. It's not a clear-cut theory, which emerged in the 70s, 80s, comes mainly from geography, from others, from local studies. And the core idea is that it's not here is society and there is nature. There is no nature out there. But the crucial question is how society, with its class structures, gendered structures, racialized structures, international structures, is appropriating nature, the elements of nature, to make its living. How mobility, food, clothing, communication is organized also biophysically. This is the main idea of political ecology. There was another strand in the 70s, a very conservative political ecology, but I would say this is the critical approach to political ecology. And then we have to say, it's not nature, it's not the environment, but it's the biophysical foundations of our life. But if we ask how this is appropriated, we have a large variety. We have subsistence economy. We have old traditional forms of indigenous economies. We have solidarity economies. We have in our countries public sectors which are not subsumed to capital accumulation, to profit making. But largely our societies are subsumed in our reproduction of food, mobility, let's say of a well-being, of a biophysical reproduction, of a good living. This is penetrated by capitalist interests, by profits, by capital accumulation. And political ecology is looking at it. It's a new perspective. It's not a political program. It's an analytical perspective to say the discourse that humanity now is overusing, is destroying the planet is a wrong perspective, because it's homogenizing humanity. There is no class structure in humanity. There is no gender structure. There is no imperial structure. It's just humanity. Just to give you an example. A very powerful mainstream discourse today is the discourse of planetary boundaries. Yeah? So humanity is overusing planetary boundaries, overusing the capacity of the climate, the capacity of biodiversity, the capacity of soils, the capacity of water. But it's not asked what are the social mechanisms, the social causes, which are, from a critical perspective, the capitalist, the imperial, the male, the very instrumentalist causes. This is not questioned in the planetary boundaries. The planetary boundaries juxtaposes humanity and the environment. And political ecology is questioning this.
Yeah, this is very, very interesting how here again we see how the power structure also behind all these processes, that the analysis of this power structure makes a difference in our perspective, how we look at things. And somehow to get back to the broader debate, also where we started from, and you mentioned also the importance of power, and when we talk about development and all these perspectives and the debates, and in a way I guess we usually think of a state when we think of a power, and we link these debates to the state. And here I would have two questions. So even if we remain in this thinking of linking power to the state power, how could we understand a state, first of all? And secondly, how could we see the role of the state in the process, in these debates?
I might comment briefly on the last question, and then I come to the state. Bryant Bailey, two authors, they call it third world political ecology. They said political ecology, which comes from local geographies, from this idea the appropriation of nature is power shaped. They said in the global south sometimes it's different because we have different social realities, and we should acknowledge it. And the second complement is that we should, from political ecology perspective, we should complement the term of power with the term of domination. And then we come to the state, because domination means also the accepted forms of power. If we think in a power relation in the tradition of Max Weber, the German sociologist, it means usually that you have an actor and the actor is able to impose on the other actor, on the other, its interests, its will, its interest. And the question of domination helps us to understand how deeply inscribed power relations are also accepted by people. They're accepted positively, but also they accept it because people don't have an alternative. So we should complement the question of power always with the question of domination, if you like, the accepted forms of power. That people in their everyday lives, they go to work, they don't like it, but they have to go because they make their living out of it. People destroy nature, they know that they destroy nature when they use a car or a plane, but they don't have an alternative and so on. So this is more domination. Coming back to your question of the state. From a critical perspective, and we also can link it to environmental questions, in the mainstream discourse, usually the state is seen as a regulator, as the maker of the rules of the game, via laws, also by the ministries distribute finance, they enable certain policies, we have a division of power, the governments, the parliament, and so on. Then in environmental politics, it said the state should shape the rules, should green the rules, and then we will solve the problems because the investment will be green, the consumption will be green. From a critical perspective, the state is not part of the solution, it's rather part of the problem because the state is deeply linked to social structures, to class structures. The state is it's listening more to powerful actors. Who comes to Georgia and says, okay, we promise we will invest in mining. We promise we will invest in tourism. We promise we will invest to modernize your airport in Tbilisi and so on. So the state is structurally more open to this. And in theorizing this constellation, I refer to Nikos Poulantzas, but since you had Klaus Offe last year here, he also worked in this direction, to say the state is not an entity, the state is not an autonomous actor, but in its interlinkage with society, class-based, gendered, and so on, the state is a social relation, and the state, as Nikos Poulantzas put it, is the material condensation of social power relations. So of course we have also trade unions, we have workers, and they have also their, let's say, resonance in the state. Environmental movements have a resonance in the state, that the state has an environment ministry, but the powerful actors and also the powerful dispositives, the powerful ideas of development, of growth, of competitiveness are inscribed in the state. So it's not the bad state officials. Sometimes we have bad state officials, we have corrupt state officials, but usually the very logics, the very understanding of the state is linked to these dominant actors. The state is structurally patriarchal. The state is structurally racist. And the other argument from a critical perspective, that despite the acknowledgement that the state is a deeply inscribed social structure linked to dominant social relations, power relations, the state is also a terrain of struggle. That social movements try to politicize issues, and also leftist parties, progressive parties say, no, the state is doing something wrong, we need social policy, we need environmental policy. And so we say the state is a terror of struggle, but, and this is important, against the background of the state structures. The state is not just an open sheet, it's not a blanket. The state has its structures, but within the structures there are struggles going on. And this means for emancipatory movements like the Greens, as parties or also as social movements or as NGOs, that these claims, these demands should be formulated also in the language of the state, in the language of laws, in the language of demands, but it should not be underestimated that there is a very powerful state structure. And a very prominent example, I would say, today is in Germany, the energy transition. The energy transition was formulated in the 90s from below, from people who wanted renewable energy. And then the state, when we had the red-green government in Germany, the Green Minister of Environment, Jürgen Trittin, reinforced the so-called renewable energy law. So the state took over certain demands out of society. And the German energy transition is quite successful. But the powerful energy producers, let's say the large companies, after some years understood that their business model is in question, and now they fight back, and now the decentralized, from the bottom up developed energy transition is now regained by the powerful energy suppliers. This is one aspect we can understand with critical state theory. And the other aspect is that now we have still lignite and coal production in Germany to produce power, and this is the reason why Germany is still one of the major emitter of CO2 emissions. So it's not the clean Germany, Germany is very polluting the world, and this also we can understand with critical state theory. And a last aspect of critical state theory is to have an other understanding of politics. Usually politics is equated in the public discourse with party politics, with elections and with the competition among parties, and then to elect a government, to elect the parliament, and then to do politics. And civil society is kind of a complement. Here the reasonable debates in the tradition of Jürgen Habermas takes place before it goes to the system, before it goes to the parties, before it goes to the state, and then the state does the real politics, the really important politics. A critical perspective would say no. Within civil society, Antonio Gramsci, an important theorist, developed this idea. Within civil society, fights are fought out over the very understanding not only of the content of politics, but what is politics about. So we need a strong civil society, a critical civil society, where the ideas against development, against growth, against capitalism are developed, and then hopefully they are condensed in the state. But many people are convinced that we need another society, not because the state says we need another society, we need feminist politics, we need anti-racist politics, but these are fights fought out within civil society, and then they might become the state. So the civil society is not only a nice complement, but civil society is itself a power structure. We have very powerful conservative forces we see in Georgia and also in Germany and Austria, but it's a struggle in itself, and this needs to be linked to of course, then state policies.
Yes, and one of the last points that you now made when we talk about the state, and we look at the state as a terrain of struggles and the role of the civil society, we of course also refer to power, and I would like to ask you to comment also on the relationship of power and knowledge in these struggles, and what is the importance of knowledge. And the second related question would be also, especially I guess for countries like Georgia, the importance of knowledge production from within, coming from the needs and from the context of the local society, in order to escape the simple copying of the ideas coming from somewhere else.
Yeah. It's two different questions. The first is, what is the role of knowledge is key, of course, when knowledge means to make sense of informations, to have discourses, to have evidences within society. The role of knowledge is key, and the knowledge today is exactly this. We need growth, we need private property, we need a lean state and so on. We need to be anti-corrupt. This is the dominant knowledge within society, and this is produced also by academic production, by international discourses, by publications of the World Bank, but also within a country like Georgia. So knowledge is something very broad, which helps people to understand where they are. And critical knowledge is, first of all, irritating the dominant knowledge, irritating the knowledge of modernization, development and growth. And in the second step, I would say also to make visible that there are always alternatives, and that to push for alternatives. So a critical knowledge might promote alternative, if you like, counter-hegemonic, not self-evident discourses, understanding, to make society different. And then we have the whole sphere of expert knowledge. I think we have a societal knowledge, which is broad, but then we have a lot of forms of expert knowledge. Yeah? In the academia, it's not the broad knowledge, it's an expert knowledge. If you go to research and development, if you go to natural sciences, if you go to engineering, you have expert knowledges. So what my question would be in Georgia, and my question is in Germany and Austria, what are the alternative forms to educate young engineers that they are able in 10, 15 years to make our society better? To really know what are soft technologies about. Natural sciences, to know what are, let's say, traditional medicines, and not to buy only the medicines from the transnational pharmaceutical companies. What are alternative forms of growing, of producing food, and not only the knowledge of the dominant actors of the agro-industry to produce food. And there's always a lot of knowledge going on in society. I imagine that in Georgia you have a lot of traditional farmers. Already traditional is a bad word. I would say alternative farmers. They might produce and contribute to the Georgian society good food. You don't need industrial food. You don't need the seeds bought from international seed banks and so on. This is concerning the first part of the question of knowledge. It's a huge field, as you might have noticed. Concerning the specialized forms of knowledge, academic or let's say a knowledge about society, social scientific knowledge. The first is that it's very important to acknowledge also that a lot is going on in Georgia and that you don't need to import only the knowledge from it. It's good to know what is also discussed in the world, but to have an own production of knowledge. And I'm not familiar with Georgia, but I can tell you from Latin America. The so-called dependency theory, the theory questioning modernization theory in the 60s, was exactly coming out from Latin America because there was a very vivid intellectual debate. What is happening in Latin America? Those coming from the north tell us you need modernization, you need capable elites, you need capital investment, you need growth. And they said, hey, stop. You tell us this, but we still remain in the periphery. We still remain weak, and our elites are oligarchs. Our elites just want to defend their status. We need an own theoretical production, which is then dependency theory. But to dig a bit deeper, the post-colonial thinking, which emerged a bit later, as I said maybe we also need to understand our societies in a different way. And I just give you an example. René Zavaleta, he was a Bolivian philosopher, and he invented a term which is very, very interesting. It's called sociedades abigaradas, overlapping societies. He said, in Bolivia and Ecuador, everybody talks about modernity, everybody talks about capitalism, everybody talks about market. But when we look into Bolivia, there are many, many different and alternative economies, the indigenous economies, the solidarities economies. So he said, it's not only the capitalist mode of production, there are different modes of production, there are different societies, overlapping societies. And what we should do is to strengthen the alternative societies, which are always there. So my question, I don't know, but my question in Georgia would be whether you have also alternative economies from peasants, from cultural workers in the cities, in the educational sector, in the health sector, which have, even if you like, post-Soviet practices, which were bureaucratic but not profit-driven. Yeah? So you have alternative practices, and to understand the societies like this and to acknowledge. And there, the northern knowledge production doesn't help you, because the northern knowledge production usually is one of modernizing thinking. So of course you should look at the critical knowledge production, like political ecology, but then what is the own knowledge in your society? And coming to the field of research, of let's say formalized research, my form of research in Austria is transdisciplinary research. Research with the stakeholders, research with the actors. I work a lot with trade unions. So the knowledge, the critical knowledge about workers, about trade unions, needs to be developed with the workers, with the trade unions. Because me as an academic, I don't know their realities. I don't know their subjectivities. I don't know their desires. So how to bring it together? I don't say that I should just listen to them, because they don't think a lot about environmental issues. So I think my role is then to push them and to irritate them and say, hey, the powerhouse of Germany needs to take seriously environmental problems. We cannot produce cars and machinery, but we need alternatives. But I want to discuss it with the trade unions, with the workers, and this is the form of transdisciplinary knowledge production. And Again, I don't know how Georgia is structured, but I think this would be good. And also for younger scholars, and especially for younger scholars, and also for the established scholars, to take seriously that academic production is not only to publish in papers and to publish in English and to be recognized in the West. Of course, this might be the bottom line, but the other form of knowledge production, to go to the fields, to work with the farmers, to work with the people in the cities, to work with the alternative knowledge holders and producers, and to bring it together.
Thank you so much
you.
For this very interesting talk, and we covered quite some key and very broad topics. And I would like at the end to share some good news that the Heinrich Böll Foundation in Georgia is translating some chapters from the book of Professor Brand, Imperial Mode of Living. So these chapters will be available in Georgian also for the Georgian readers. Thank you.
Thank you.